Hello, everyone. I'm quite honored today to be here as the chair of the Citizen Resources and Protection. Firstly, I'd like to introduce myself first. My name is Qin Gong from the South China Sea Institute of the Oceanology, CES, in the Dr. Lin Chang's lab. And today, Dr. David Booth and I will chair this session, and I'd like to introduce the first two speakers, Dr. David Booth and Lily Stanton, and then it's David Booth's turn. Okay, firstly, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, the Dr. David Booth. David Booth leads the UTS Fish Ecology Lab in Sydney, Australia. The lab researches marine fish ecology on coral reefs in estuaries and along temperate coasts. They are particularly interested in the sustainability of the iconic species such as the sea dragons and the effects of the climate change on fish and their habits. In fact, Dr. David Booth have given a presentation yesterday about two pet fish. Today he will give another presentation named the Weedy Sea Dragon Demography Study. Okay, Booth, now it's your turn.
So thanks, Jingdu. Yes, I'll share my screen in a minute. But first of all, thank you very much, because you are the one that did all the organisation here. I did nothing except was part of it, so much appreciated.
Okay, that's my pleasure.
I'm just going to do the good old screen share, if I may. Here we go. And there we go. See that? That's a good sign. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Disappointed I can't be in Guangzhou. I've been there before. It's a wonderful city, but maybe next year, huh? And I wanted to talk today about some of our work on my favourite cygnathid, or one of them anyway, the Weedy sea dragon, and a little bit about some of the citizen science that can go with this animal. So, of course, it's not new to science by any means, and the mythical dragon has been captured in photographs from a long, long time ago. That's nearly 200 years ago by William Gould. Very nice picture. A little bit about the general biology of this organism. Now, there are three dragons that have been identified. The Weedy or common dragon, I prefer Weedy as its name, occurs around southern Australia, pretty much from just north of Sydney to pretty much an equivalent latitude in the Western Australia. And the others, the leafy sea dragon, is a little bit more restricted southwards, and the fairly new and excitingly discovered ruby sea dragon has been found in deeper water, about 50 metres off Western Australia, which really brings out the exciting possibility that extends further, or there are others down there somewhere. It's so poorly explored to this date. So just a little bit of background. So it's endemic to Australia, as are the other sea dragons, as far as we know to this date. It's been recognised as of least concern with the IUCN, but it is protected all around Australia under Commonwealth Acts, and also with our state acts. So the animal's protected from collection or any sort of disturbance like that, although the habitat it lives in is not so well protected. So it lives variously in kelp, particularly where the kelp meets the sand, but also can occur in different parts of the country on seagrass. The camouflage, even though you often see pictures of the sea dragon, it looks bright orange. Under natural light, it certainly camouflages much better with the surrounding kelp, and it's just flash photography brings out those beautiful orange colours. Preference for food, mysid shrimp. Its long snout and suctorial feeding makes them fairly easy prey for this animal, and it can gobble up lots of them, and they live in groups. And swarms occur of those animals. We've tagged these animals for a number of years, as I'll mention a bit later, and found they have very high site fidelity. We've found them within 10s, 20s, 30 metres of the original tagging point. We had one animal that was found 2 to 3 kilometres away across a bay, That was the unusual one. It could have been swept across by storms, but otherwise they stick very close to home. They have been aged by us, and I'll talk about that in a minute, up to 8 years of age. So they're one of the longest living cygnathids. And conveniently, the eggs are deposited on the male's tail in an exposed manner. So convenient, I say, for predators, unfortunately, but also for scientists for monitoring their numbers and their loss and fecundity in general. They can deposit up to around 200 eggs in this manner, and they develop the eggs, and the babies are hatched after about 1 month or so in the warmer waters. We're not too sure about where it's a bit colder. We're now learning more and more about this fascinating animal, including how the morphology changes across its range, but also the genetics. And you'll hear a talk in a minute by Selma Clanton, who'll give you more information on that. So as I mentioned, they're considered least concerned under the IUCN Red List. Previously to that, they were considered near threat. So they really are fairly data deficient at this point, but the data we're collecting at the moment and in future should bear on that categorization in the Red List. So as I mentioned, distribution is around the south of Australia, and we're quite interested in our lab on what limits their northern distribution. Why don't they extend further north? Well, the story has something to do with the distribution of their kelp, which is mainly a southern, the Aclonia and other sorts of kelp is mainly southern. And this brings up the interesting question of what's going to happen to sea dragons under climate change. Maybe something directly, but also indirectly. That kelp is known to be retracting, and some combination of the kelp and the distribution of their food really could be driving their distribution and potential retraction southwards in future. And you'll hear more about this in a talk by Sam Allen pretty soon. So as I mentioned, we're mainly interested, or mainly been able so far to investigate this animal in the southeast parts of its range, from north of Sydney down to Hobart in Tasmania, you can see there, and around Melbourne and a bit beyond that. So this is what I'll be discussing. So one of the key things that ecologists like to do is to be able to track individual animals. That way you can get direct data on their growth, their movement, their survival, their fecundity, reproduction, etc. So a little bit problematic in sea dragons. They have a very hard, bony exoskeleton. And one of the early attempts we made back in the early 2000s when we started the work with my then PhD student, Jaime Sanchez Camara, who's now back in Spain, but really pioneered a lot of this work. We noticed, of course, that appendages were missing, and each dragon had a story to tell in terms of loss of appendages or scars or whatever, broken tails. So we tried this at first. So there was lots of sketching, and we got some information out of this, but we noticed some of the appendages grew back awfully quickly. So what was a distinctive mark didn't stay that way for long. So it wasn't really a satisfactory way to get a large number of animals followed. Then, based on our work on the reef, where we're using this technique of visible implant elastomer, where a injection of a little bit of inert fluorescent paint is injected below the animal's skin, has been used very successfully in our long-term studies on the reef, and we've tracked dams of fish and other things for over a decade up on the reef. A little bit tricky with any sort of cygnathid to get a spot where you can actually put this, but we managed to do so. And the work I'll present really concerns following individuals tagged in this way. You're able to follow them even at night by shining a fluorescent or a UV torch onto them, and the fluorescence shows up. The photograph on the bottom right doesn't show that very well, but that's an animal that's being subjected to fluorescent UV light, and the fluorescent tag is showing up. This works very well, except it really is labor intensive, and you've got to handle the animal, as you can see up on the top right, which is not a desirable situation. But the fluorescent elastomer can stay in place, as I said, for a long time if you position it correctly. Growth can be done very crudely by imaging and photographing or measuring directly individual animals, and there we are back in the 2000s doing just that. And based on that and looking at individual animals, and you can then track them and get some idea of growth through time. And so these data were obtained in that way and published. And not surprisingly, the population in Sydney, up at a latitude of about 34 south, was a little bit quicker than those in Tasmania, down at around 40 south. And the animals are slightly larger eventually. So we're able to get growth information on the data on these animals with individual tagging. In the process of following these animals, we're also able to look at their abundances in the wild and do spot checks on numbers across different locations. And what we noticed was some sites, some of the ones in Sydney and also in Tasmania, were showing what seemed to be a decline over about an 8-year period. Other sites were fairly stable. And so this was of some concern. And so we've been following this up ever since. Of course, reproduction, as I mentioned, they're very conveniently placing eggs on the outside of the male's tail, and we're able to follow the timing and the behaviour of reproduction by observing the animals. And at least in Sydney, there appears to be an increase in the proportion of males in carrying eggs. And in fact, nearly all males seem to carry eggs in the later November period. And the babies that we have seen, and they're very few and difficult to see, they're very cryptic, have been showing up in the following year. So we're able to get this sort of information. The males also have a behaviour where they move from a deeper situation, 10 to 12 metres, up to about 2 or 3 metres in the Sydney area around this time. The other aspect, and of course, one way to engage the public, but also get more very useful information, is through what we call citizen science. And of course, one of the world's most famous citizens, David Attenborough, led the charge here, where he, whether he meant to or not, was interviewed and asked a couple of times what his favourite animal on the planet was. And he said, and we all cheered in our lab, that the Weedy seadragon was his favourite. Now, maybe he changed his mind, or maybe he was just put on the spot, but we'll take it. Thank you very much. So there is a great interest in these animals. They're extremely iconic, and in Australia especially. Several of the states of Australia have them as their fishy emblem. And indeed, they've inspired a number of children's books that we've actually helped with. This is the most recent one here. And there's some beautiful illustrations in there, and they really tell a bit of a story, and there's a bit of science in the back, etc., just to engage people about these animals, because not everyone jumps in the water and has a look at them. But more seriously, an aspect that we've been investigating is the use of citizen divers. And we're lucky in Sydney, we have a group called the Underwater Research Group, many of whom are scientists in their own right. Two here lead the project in terms of the citizen science. The Underwater Research Group's been going since the late 1950s. And so we were able to, or we've been doing some ongoing work with them, firstly in the historical sense. Now, these are some images, and one particular diver, Clary Lawler, who just sadly passed away last year at age 92, I think it was one of those people who are very fastidious, and they keep dive logs very accurately from his diving since the 60s. So a number of these divers, we've been able to obtain their logs and interface their observations really for about 70 years now. We've still got a lot of work to do on this. And the logs are actually quite a fun read. A lot of them are annotated with photographs and observations of unusual fish, but very rarely do they fail to mention seeing a sea dragon. So it's quite good that they are iconic and obvious, because they're recorded. And according to Clary, every time you see a sea dragon, you would record it in your log. So transferring all these lovely data onto Excel seemed a bit of a travesty, but that's what we've done for the sea dragon and other species. And not going too much into data, because there's still more to collect, and we can start seeing some sorts of patterns in the long term. There was a period in the 70s where, despite plenty of people out there, very few sea dragons were observed, and then there were more in the 90s and 2000s. So we realised that any patterns that we see in our decade of study may be part of these longer term cycles that we don't really understand, but have been recorded by the divers. The other aspect, another way to working with citizen scientists, citizen divers, is to use photos and photo IDs. Photo IDs are very good, because most of these divers are expert photographers, much better than myself, and they're able to take close-up photos, which we can then use to individually recognise dragons using a spot recognition pattern. This same program has been used to trace manta rays, giant squids, etc. So this is just an example of an animal that has been matched based on its flank spot pattern. Quite often the divers like to name these, which is all very nice, and we can follow them through time. So it's a tagging method that doesn't involve actually touching the animal at all, which is quite useful. One of the neat things about photos is you can go backwards. With our tagging, we can only go forwards. Once we've tagged an animal, we can only follow it from there. But with photographs, through archival footage, and every diver keeps their favourite photos, we're able to pick up a number of animals that have been photographed in the past. This particular one, called David, but not named after me, had been photographed for 6 years previously. So we can get a bit of an age estimate on animals in this way. Back to abundance, we're in the process of looking through data that we've collected since on the sites that I mentioned earlier to see if these declines, if we saw them, have continued by combining scientific surveys with citizen data, anecdotal reports, etc. Some of the sites, especially in Tasmania, have been worryingly showing almost complete loss of sea dragons from sites they historically were, whereas others have been all right. So this is ongoing work, but hopefully this will help inform the next red list assessment of these particular animals. Then, of course, any diver that's out there can note quite easily reproduction, whether the eggs are there or missing on individual animals they're following day after day. So we can get information on that. They can also provide us information about the interaction of the sea dragons with their mysid food, because these swarms of tiny crustaceans are pretty obvious if they're there, and the feeding behaviour is pretty distinct. So we can get information from the citizen sciences of this sort of thing. And indeed, we can get a list of different things that we can get from these people who are out there quite often and are very good observers, in fact. Things like abundance, density, the movement of the animals based on their photographs in different times, reproduction, ID itself. We can, by simple rulers, images and image software, work out links of these animals that they've tagged, and therefore get information on growth, and also a whole series of behaviours, as well as the fact that we can interrogate the divers for their old photos, which they're very happy to show us, and maybe spot animals they've seen in the past. An example of where we've had really good engagement has been in Melbourne, which is an interesting area. As Selwyn Clanton will tell you, their dragons are a little bit different down there. And Katie Mills has been a real trooper in getting lots and lots of people out recording the dragons. And that's a really useful set of information we're getting from them. But even more interestingly is the rise of sea dragon search. I've written dragon search, it's actually sea dragon search, that Chrissy Tusterson already has told you about a couple of days ago in this very conference. This is a really exciting new initiative which will interface with what we've done already with the images, that uploads diver photos and puts them through a machine learning algorithm to really match them very well with previous sightings, and so we can get good information on the dragons through time. And again, the person who sees this gets to name them, which is kind of cool. So that just gives you a brief summary of where we're going to with the various projects. And as I said, a couple of talks ahead of me or now will describe some of the work in much more detail. So yes, key information on distribution abundance, changes through time, demography, and hopefully this will all help inform refining red list assessments in future. So with that, I'll say thanks very much and happy to entertain questions.
Okay. Anyone who wants to ask questions can unmute yourself and speak, please. Of course, you can also raise your hand up so I can help you to unmute you.
There's another kid's book too while you're waiting. Very lovely pictures. Very lovely pictures. Very lovely. Yes.
Oh, it's your work? It's your work?
No.
Oh,
We've advised them on the science behind it, but they're the ones doing all the wonderful photos and stories for the children. There's even been a play about it too. So
okay, I'd like to buy some next time when I
yeah,
go to Australia. Thank you.
please come.
So,
Yes.
okay, so there is no, so I'd like to ask the first question. So, it's really interesting about the sea dragon work, and I'd like to know about more details about their movement. We know that the Weedy sea dragon also can't swim fast, and I'm wondering whether they could migrate from the for example, from the cold water to the warm waters when the seasons change, or from the shallow water to the deep seas.
Yeah, as you say, they're not very motile. They can swim and move. They're not too bad at maneuvering. We'll call it maneuvering rather than moving. But they seem to move back and forth with the tide, at least at the sites we're looking at. And so you can actually follow them drifting. However, when they want to stop, they can. They just go down out of the tide into the kelp. But certainly the one we found of all our tagged animals, and there were hundreds of these, that we found further than 50 meters to 100 meters away from where we tagged it, was across the other side of a large bay. And it's still confusing about how it might have gotten there, but certainly some large storms were up, and it's possible they either were transported on a raft of kelp that had ripped off, or maybe they do have amazing swimming capacity we don't know about. The babies, again, are very, not great swimmers. They can maneuver, but not necessarily swim. So as far as moving, potentially they could move up and down from deep to shallow, like the males do, from about 10 to 12 meters to shallow water. But otherwise, I don't think they have much capacity for movement in a rapid sense.
Okay, I just think that because I've read the previous papers or the data in the website, most of the recording about the Weedy sea dragon was from the divers. Yeah, I'm wondering, maybe the Weedy sea dragon, just like some other seahorse species, they can move from the shallow waters to the deep seas where the divers can't reach. So we don't get this type of information.
Well, that's interesting because the ruby sea dragon has only been found at those depths deeper than a diver, but we've certainly had enough surveys off Sydney using ROVs and other sorts of things to be pretty sure we're not just missing a large population below diver depth. It's possible, but no, I don't think so.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. The time is over.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Next round. Thank you, David.